what's happening after Beijing. So this is something I have prepared regarding the economy, but I wrote it into have more and to be linking to what Elizabeth has presented, but also other people have presented what is happening 30 years after Beijing. And focusing very much on the challenges and the backlashes that we are facing today. We yeah. So this is the platform that I presented yesterday in the introduction, the platform of action, the strategic objectives that we had in 1995, in identifying all these issues: poverty, education, training, health, violence, armed conflict, economy, decision-making, institutional mechanisms, human rights, women in the media, environment, girl child. We have spoken about all of this. And this has been a very, you could say, yes, there have been advances, but there are still lots of challenges, and in some ways, lots of setbacks, what we call backlashes. So if we go to women and poverty, I have in general a commentary I make for a radio station next every 2 weeks. And in my last comment, I was discussing and doing a comparison of the kind of budgets spent, as Elizabeth said, weapons, defense, and the ones spent in poverty, regarding hunger in the world. Global poverty declined in 1990, nearly 36% of the world population living in extreme poverty. By 2015, 10%. However, this progress has been quite uneven. Women remain disproportionately affected. And in this program, UNDP development program, for that women constituted 70% of the world's poor. This figure is criticized because it reflects, although it reflects a lot of realities as well. In recent estimates, about 10.3% of the world women worldwide live still in extreme poverty. And we have regional variations. As I pointed, it's very different. Sub-Saharan Africa, you have the highest rate of female poverty, limited access to assets. South Asia, also gender non-restricted women mobility. Latin America, there are advances, but there's still a lot of economic inequality. Middle East, low female force participation, as we saw in my introduction, and lots of legal barriers. And then recent challenges, we had the pandemic, which affected disproportionately women everywhere, and it was evident even in the World Bank estimates how labor market, where women were the majority, were extremely affected by the pandemic measures. 47 million women and girls were pushed into extreme poverty because of the pandemic. Climate change, women, rural and vulnerable communities suffer more. And we have seen also in different presentations these facts: conflict and displacement, wars and displacement. For example, we have deepened enormously women poverty. Again, this table, which I showed you first, women are half of the working force. So what happens with that? Yes, half of the working force, but also in extreme vulnerable milieu, environmental problems, and we have a very vulnerable labor force, which is always in the margins, because they have very difficult to go forward, to climb in the hierarchies, and they are subject to all these kind of disaster. It can be a economic crisis, it can be a natural catastrophes, all these consequences of climate change and many other things. So what happens then? The gender gap. The gender gap was being, it was decreasing, but now there is still a gender gap, approximately 20%. Men are still getting more income than women. And this disparity is particularly pronounced in sectors like technology, finance, leadership roles. And despite of these various efforts during many decades to close this gap, this progress is very slow and sometimes it goes backwards. It went backwards also in some regions because of this pandemic. So the United Nations reports that achieving gender equality in the workplace is critical for economic growth, but that could add 12 trillion to global GDP by bridging this gender gap would add 12 trillion to global GDP by 2025. Well, that was I think 35. It may be a mistake. So gender and reproductive rights, this among the biggest backlashes, and we have to name that because mention that from the United States, all the Supreme Court rulings, that we have seen such a dramatic change in the United States that many states now are forbidding abortion, to Europe. The worst case is Poland, as we have seen, with these strictest abortion laws in 2020, and they are still there. They are still there because in spite of the government changes, the prime minister changes, they have not been able to return to the legislation that permitted abortion before the coming to power of this conservative government. So they have not been able to do it. So we have this as an enormous backlash. And regarding political representation, yes, parliament representation has advanced. For example, in 1995, women had about, in average, 11% of seats in national parliaments. By 2025, it has gone up to 27%. And gender parity has been achieved in several countries. It was 7 countries in their single or lower, or sometimes upper parliamentary chambers like Rwanda, Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexico, Bolivia, Andorra, and the United Arab Emirates. So, but not so many countries. How many countries in the world we have? And this has been achieved only in 7 countries, according to these figures. And also, instead of having 50%, we still have 27%. Impact of gender quotas. Yes, they have given higher representations. Nations with quotas had 31% women in parliament, comparing to 16 in countries without such measures. But you have dramatic examples where quotas have not functioned because of many different factors. One of the cases I have seen myself is the case of Brazil, which is one of the lowest. They have quotas, but in such a way that is not affecting the voting. So they have among the lowest representation of women in parliament, even though they have had a women president. They are extremely low. So there are many factors concerning how quotas work or do not work. So in regional highlights regarding political representation in Europe, we have seen an increase in women representation, reaching an average of 33% in 2024, especially countries like Finland, Sweden, Spain have surpassed 40%, aided by legislative quotas. Well, not in the case of Sweden, but in the case of other countries. In Latin America, we had the case of Argentina, but especially the case of Bolivia and Mexico, which I have studied very much. And Mexico had finally its first woman president in last year, 2024. In the case of sub-Saharan countries, we have Rwanda, where we have women holding 61% of parliamentary seats, but still most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa have not yet come close to these averages. So challenges in these trends, despite of women representations, in 2024, women parliamentary representation grew only by 0.3%, the lowest rate since 2017. There's an underrepresentation in leadership. 2025, women hold top state positions in only 25 countries. And how many countries do we have in the world? Moreover, the proportion of women heading ministries decreased from nearly 23% in 2025 from 23% the previous year. So we have persistent barriers, structural challenges, societal norms, political violence for women that are represented, and they are also the target of a lot of political violence. I have studied particularly the case of Bolivia myself. Lack of political will, limited access to campaign finances continue to hinder women's full participation in politics. So we have a lot of structural barriers and mentalities that hinder that. So the far right, economic crisis, conflicts, criminality, climate change, several countries in the world, as we know, they have extreme right groups that want to attain power and want to reverse feminist and sexual minority groups' advances. They preach, as we know, conservative values, set back the clock for women's and sexual diversity rights. But there's also, as we saw with the Elizabeth economic crisis, austerity. We have wars, conflicts, criminality, more violence affecting particularly women. Climate change, of course, as we said, resulting, among others, in increasing migration challenges, and we have horrendous migration measures, especially in the case of Europe or the United States or many other in the global north, that stops this migration, but they don't stop the causes of migration. So what we need is finding our way back to Beijing's walls. And how do we do that? We have seen that history is not a linear process of progressive advances. It seems to run in circles, advances and setbacks. But a human being has an agency, and women have acquired an enormous agency through history. So feminist movements should reorganize themselves, gain force, joining forces, strategies that unite, that go beyond divides. I think that only united movements can stop these setbacks, these backlashes. And we have to look forward, look ahead without forgetting what has already been achieved. Those are my own reflections on this. So the only strategy, in my view, we can try to reflect on this, is going beyond nationalism, beyond class differences, beyond traditions, beyond sexual identities, beyond generations, in this enormous effort to unite forces, to do something massively. And that's what I want to say at the end. Thank you. And if you have any reflection or any question on this, please. So any question, any reflection? Yes, Linda.
Thank you, Edmé, for a very interesting presentation, and it's a really good way of kind of summing up the discussions that we've had here previously today and other parts of the conference as well. But I would like to kind of maybe take a step back and listen a little bit more to the comments that Elizabeth made about community and ways of organizing, and also uh, Olga's discussion of grassroots movements, because I have been, my experience is not all that big. I haven't seen the world, but a lot of the things that I recognize, of course, are the kind of the national level statistics, economic consequences. Of course, they're very clear. But if we're looking at the grassroots level, I think we're seeing a lot of things that are going on at the local level. We've seen a lot of things happening at the community level. I mean, okay, a lot of women are not making it to national assemblies, but that doesn't mean that women are not political and that they are addressing issues at their local level where they are locally affected.
Mm.
So I think this is one of the things we need to keep in mind when we are talking about the backlash, because yes, it is clear that at national levels, maybe things are not moving forward as fast as possible, as much as we expected them to. But that does not mean that they are not being these kinds of issues are not being challenged at the local and the community levels. And I'm not just talking about maybe in the Western context. As you know, I'm very interested in India, and there I see a lot of local politicians, at the local community level. Women are very active. They are very creative. They are making mountains out of mud hills because they have no resources. They are underfinanced, but they are moving forward, and they're being very creative about things that are central importance for them. Care of their children, education for their children, food security, these kinds of issues are very prominent at local levels. And I see the same when I look at the United States, which is a little weird at the moment. But you have a lot of good, local politicians who are moving forward despite Trump and his nutters, so I'm just asking maybe that we keep an open mind and not throw out the baby with the bathwater, that we see that there are possibilities that Beijing isn't dead, and that maybe we don't agree on a lot of things, but we agree on some things. Yeah.
Thank you, Linda. And as we are recording, I will say that Linda's perhaps contribution is this, and I think it's the same as Elizabeth. We have a lot of good things still at the local level, resistance movements at the grassroots level everywhere in the world, and you are completely right. And one thing doesn't say the other doesn't exist, which is what we are trying to say. And we have the macro level and they have the micro level in which we see these contradictions. Of course, what I was just trying to do is to bring some trends that we see everywhere, but also Elizabeth gave us an extraordinary good overview of all these local trends and all these possibilities of going together in different areas, in different places. I also have several examples of that. When I go to, every 4 years, we have what we call encuentros, the Continental Latin American Feminist Forums. And I have been to the latest 3 ones. And each time I go there, it's like charging your batteries. I mean, because you see all what you are naming. You see all these people, they are not from all the world. It's Latin American speaking, but incredible. With such a force, with such an energy, and with such a positive kind of, I would say, ambition to go and to bring something and to build something. And of course, they are also confronting a lot of challenges, but they are doing things all the time at the grassroots level, because you have groups of all over the continent coming there. So yes, of course, we see that, but we also see what's coming from above, and that's what we have to look at both ends. But there was somebody else.
We just mentioned. Connect with what you were saying, at the local level, there is a lot more. And my previous job, I was working on the topic on women, peace and security, Congo and Burundi and Rwanda. One of the learning questions of the theory of change was trying to find out under the Resolution 2025 framework, in which moment women, so when they get into the leadership, who are they representing? So how is that when women at the local level are working so much to create social fabric and they can get into other settings, are they still representing the people of the local level? So here my big question is how we still get this gap, because we put a lot of emphasis on women representation, but who are they representing? And what we have to learn, I think, from this is that this has been more an instrumentalization of the representation of women representation, and those who are not, all of them are representing the values that we dreamed about. So that is something that I think it's important that we have in mind. It's not just about new representation, but who is representing what, that we should also focus a lot on that. And then thinking that it's just not only about women representing, but just it's the values that we want to see represented that we have to start in there.
Yes, absolutely right. We have to question who is representing whom and what is being represented. And of course, we have terrible examples of women represented very, very, you could say, backwards trends, populism in Europe, by the case of Italy and France are extremely important. And yes, of course, we have to do that. But we don't, I think that I agree with what you say, but we still have to give that struggle. I mean, women should be represented, whatever the situation, 50-50, because they are 50% of the population. And of course, we cannot idealize that everything is going to be all right for all women, but we still have to struggle on that front, I think. So it's the same as in the labor market. Women should be integrated, but in a fair way, not in an exploitative way into labor market. But they should get this kind of integration as well. I think that we are arriving to the time when we have a coffee break, and then we have the last session. We are waiting for the last panelist who's on her way here.
She's here.
She's here.
Yeah.
Okay,
She's
good.
charging her batteries for.
So we have this break, this coffee break. I think we can have it 15 minutes and then try to come back so we have the last session and we can go home. Thank you.